Camille Johnson was excited to enjoy her well-earned first-class seat. But before she could relax, she was asked to give it up for a powerful billionaire. Should she back down or stand her ground? This confrontation was about more than just a seat. It was about justice, dignity, and a shocking twist that stunned the entire first-class cabin. The yellow taxi pulled into the main driveway of JFK Airport, gliding to a smooth stop in front of the first-class terminal. Camille Johnson let out a slow breath, her gaze sweeping over the steady stream of travelers beyond the glass doors. Without hurry, she adjusted her cream-colored blazer, pulled up the handle of her carry-on, and stepped out of the car with effortless confidence. As a black woman in business, Camille knew, too well, the battle she had fought to stand where she was today. She had started as a young programmer, overlooked in meetings, dismissed before she even spoke, turned away more times than she could count, because too many people refused to believe that a black woman could build and run a tech company. But none of it had stopped her. And now, after 5 relentless years, she had just secured the biggest deal of her career. A $20 million investment into her software firm. A victory built on sleepless nights, high-stakes negotiations, and the kind of persistence that did not know the meaning of surrender. Tonight, she was rewarding herself with a first-class ticket from New York to San Francisco. The first-class check-in had no line. A uniformed agent greeted her with a polished smile, scanning her ticket, flipping through her passport, and printing her boarding pass with swift efficiency. "Thank you for flying with us today, Ms. Johnson." Camille returned the smile, took her pass, and walked toward the priority lane. As she passed the long, winding line at security, she felt the glances, subtle, lingering, assessing. A black woman, poised and polished, walking through the VIP entrance. She was used to it. She had spent years feeling the weight of those looks. And now, she barely even acknowledged them. Her steps remained steady, her head held high, as she breezed through security and into the first-class lounge. Inside, the world was quiet. Plush leather seating, a sleek bar with curated cocktails, trays of hors d'oeuvres, untouched and artfully arranged. Everything here was a world apart from the crowded chaos of economy just beyond its doors. Camille settled into a chair by the window and ordered an espresso. She took a slow sip, watching the planes taxiing across the runway, their massive forms preparing to take flight. For the first time in weeks, her mind quieted. The weight of deals, deadlines, and expectations eased, if only for a moment. When boarding was called, Camille walked through the private first-class entrance, stepping into the cabin with effortless grace. The space was immaculate. Wide leather seats, ample legroom, attentive crew members, ready before you even had to ask. She found her seat, 1A, right by the window. Prime real estate. Lowering herself into the chair, she placed her handbag neatly beside her, exhaled, and closed her eyes for a brief second. This felt good. She worked for this. She deserved this. But just as Camille was beginning to savor the moment, a voice cut through the quiet. "Ms. Johnson, we have a VIP who needs this seat. Would you mind moving to economy?" Her eyes snapped open. A flight attendant stood before her, composed but uncertain. The words had been spoken firmly, but there was hesitation in her eyes. Camille's brow furrowed. Something about this, all of this, felt wrong. Camille looked up at the woman standing before her. Amanda Rivers, the head flight attendant, wore a perfectly pressed uniform, the golden insignia gleaming on her lapel. There was a flicker of tension in her eyes, but her voice remained steady, professional. "Miss Johnson, we have a VIP passenger who requires this seat. Would you be willing to move to economy class?" The words hit Camille like a slap across the face. She frowned, studying Amanda carefully, as if waiting for a more reasonable explanation. But no, the flight attendant remained poised, her polite, rehearsed smile still in place, as if she had just made the most ordinary request in the world. Camille crossed her arms over her chest and asked, her voice low, steady, "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Amanda inhaled lightly before repeating herself, this time with a touch more caution. A sharp pressure tightened in Camille's chest. She had paid for this seat. She wasn't some standby passenger. She wasn't a guest. She had worked relentlessly, fought tooth and nail for every inch of space she had carved out in a world that so often pushed black women aside. And yet, here she was, in the very seat she had rightfully claimed, being asked to give it up. She took a deep breath, willing down the indignation rising inside her. "Why should I?" she asked, her gaze fixed on Amanda. Amanda swallowed, as if she hadn't expected such direct defiance. For a brief moment, she hesitated, then pressed on. "I understand, Miss Johnson, but this is a special case. The passenger in question is an important businessman who requires a workspace." Camille let out a quiet laugh, soft, but weighted with something undeniable. "Oh, really? An important businessman?" She enunciated every word carefully, eyes never leaving Amanda's. "And I'm not." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Amanda's face. Camille could tell the woman didn't want a confrontation, but she was trapped in a difficult position. "We were hoping for your cooperation. As an apology, we're prepared to offer you a complimentary ticket or an upgrade on a future flight." Camille's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. "Cooperation," she repeated, as if tasting the word, weighing its meaning. "You're asking me to give up my seat because some man thinks he's more important than I am?" Amanda's voice remained calm, carefully measured. "That's not what we're saying, Miss Johnson. We're simply trying to find the best solution for everyone involved." But Camille felt the rage surge inside her. How many times had this happened to her? How many times had she been scrutinized, doubted, dismissed? How many times had she been asked, no, expected, to step aside, to accept that she didn't belong? From the moment she was the only black girl in her coding class, to the countless meetings where her voice was ignored, people had spent their entire lives trying to make her feel small. But she was not small, and she would not yield. Camille straightened, meeting Amanda's gaze head-on. "No, I'm not going anywhere." This time, her voice was firm as stone. Amanda blinked, clearly taken aback by Camille's unwavering resolve. A heavy silence settled over the first-class cabin. A few passengers had begun to take notice of the exchange. Camille could feel their eyes on her. Some probably thought she was overreacting. Some might have silently agreed with her, but wouldn't dare speak up. And some simply didn't care, because it wasn't their problem. But to Camille, this was a problem. Amanda pressed her lips together, then finally gave a small nod. "I understand. Please excuse me for a moment." She turned swiftly and walked toward the flight crew's service area. Camille exhaled, steadying herself. But as she lifted her gaze again, she caught sight of a man stepping into the first-class cabin. He stopped directly in front of her row. Richard Coleman, real estate tycoon, one of the most powerful billionaires in America. And he was looking at Camille with a gaze full of unmistakable disdain. Richard Coleman stepped into the first-class cabin with an air of absolute authority. His navy blue suit was impeccably tailored, his Rolex catching the soft golden light overhead. Men like him didn't need to announce their status. It was in the way they walked, the way they looked at people, the way an entire flight crew snapped to attention the moment they appeared. He stopped directly in front of Camille, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, not as a person, but as if she were an object to be appraised. "You're the one sitting here?" His voice was deep, slow, commanding. Camille folded her arms and looked up at him, not rushing to respond. She could see it in his eyes, the unshakable confidence of a man who was used to being prioritized, to giving orders and having them obeyed. But she wasn't his employee, and she was under no obligation to step aside just because a man like him thought he was more important. She shrugged, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Yes, I'm the one sitting here, and I have no intention of giving up my seat." Richard's brow furrowed slightly, as if he hadn't quite heard her correctly. "I need this seat to work. I assumed you'd understand that." Camille let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "You assume I have nothing important to do? Or do you just assume that whatever you do is more important?" This time, Richard narrowed his eyes, actually looking at her instead of glancing past her. "Who are you?" The doubt in his voice was unmistakable, like he couldn't quite believe that a black woman would sit here, hold her ground, and tell him no. Camille didn't owe him an answer, but she gave him one just to watch his reaction. "Camille Johnson, CEO of CJ Tech." Richard blinked. Just once, But that single moment of hesitation told her he recognized the name, if not fully, then at least vaguely. Still, instead of acknowledging her as an equal, he merely smirked. On one of those small tech startups. I see. It was a dismissal, a subtle, well-practiced way of minimizing her. Camille recognized it instantly, because she had heard it all before. Dismissed when she was a young programmer, ignored in meetings with investors, told again and again that her success was just luck. She had endured all of it, and she didn't need to prove her worth to Richard Coleman. She leaned back in her seat, her voice steady, unwavering. If you needed this seat, you should have booked it in advance. Like I did. Richard's jaw tightened, just a fraction. He wasn't used to being denied. Turning to Amanda, his voice dropped into a clipped command. I don't have time for this. Handle it. Amanda looked more anxious now, but there was nothing she could do if Camille refused to move. So she called for David Larkin, the flight supervisor. Less than a minute later, a middle-aged man in a crew uniform approached. David Larkin had the composed look of someone accustomed to diffusing situations, but even he seemed slightly uneasy as he glanced between Camille and the billionaire standing beside her. He leaned toward Camille, his voice polite, measured. Miss Johnson, we sincerely apologize for this situation. We understand you booked this seat, but would you consider relocating? We'd be happy to offer you a free flight or an upgrade on a future trip. Camille met his gaze, fully aware of what was happening. Why should I give up my seat for him? Her voice wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. David hesitated. We're simply trying to find the best solution for everyone involved. No, you're trying to find the best solution for Richard Coleman. Her words cut through the air, sharp and precise. The tension in the cabin thickened. A few passengers started whispering. Some shook their heads, wondering why Camille was making a scene. Some watched with quiet understanding, unwilling to get involved. And some simply didn't care, because this wasn't their problem. But to Camille it was. She stood up, not to leave, but to face them all. Her voice rang clear, unshaken. Why am I expected to cooperate just because he's Richard Coleman? Why am I supposed to accept this injustice? Silence. No one answered. No one dared. The cabin was utterly still. She could see the unease growing among the flight attendants. Richard, on the other hand, clenched his jaw and used to being denied, especially in public. And then, a voice cut through the silence. A blonde woman mid-30s stood up from a row behind them. Sophie Miller, a young attorney. She folded her arms and spoke with crisp certainty. She has the right to sit here. This isn't just about a seat. It's about respecting basic rights. Sophie's words shattered the silence. A few passengers nodded. A man murmured something to his wife. An older woman watched Camille, quiet but approving. Richard realized in that moment that the tide had turned. He wasn't the only one with power in this cabin anymore. With mounting pressure from Camille and the subtle shift in the room, David Larkin exhaled and leaned toward Richard, murmuring something in his ear. Richard cast Camille one last sharp glance, then turned on his heel and walked away. He hadn't won, and Camille hadn't moved an inch. She had held her ground. The Boeing 777 trembled slightly as passengers continued settling into their seats. The soft rustling of seatbelts, quiet murmurs, and the captain's voice over the intercom blended into the familiar hum of first class. But in seat 1A, the air was different. Camille Johnson sat firmly in her seat, her gaze steady sharp. In front of her stood Richard Coleman, one of the most powerful men in real estate, staring at her as if she had personally offended him. No, not just offended him. She had done something far worse. She had denied him. His head tilted slightly, his razor-sharp gaze drifting over her, from the elegant coils of her natural hair down to the pristine cream-colored suit she wore. He was searching for a flaw, a weakness, a sign that she didn't belong. But Camille gave him nothing. She simply looked back at him, calm, unwavering. Richard let out a short, humorless chuckle. Tight, controlled. You seem like someone who enjoys attention. Camille leaned back, eyes still locked onto him. Is that so? Her voice was soft as silk, yet beneath it lay an unspoken challenge. You think when a woman refuses to step aside, it means she's just looking for attention? Her question was a blade, thin, sharp, deliberate. Richard raised an eyebrow, momentarily caught in an uncomfortable position. But he recovered quickly. Slowly, he pulled a hand from his pocket, rested it against the seat in front of her, and leaned in, closing the space between them. I'm not used to being told no. Camille's lips curved just slightly, not in amusement, but in familiarity. Well then, today must be a very special day for you. Richard's jaw tightened, a small movement, but she caught it. He was irritated. She could tell he was used to debating with powerful CEOs, but he had likely never argued with someone who wasn't afraid of him. Richard inhaled slowly, studying her now with something more than irritation. You know who I am, don't you? Camille blinked once, deliberately slow. I know exactly who you are. I also know you're the kind of man who assumes that the moment you walk into a room, everything will bend to your will. She tilted her head slightly, her voice still smooth, but every word carried the weight of iron. But unfortunately for you, Mr. Coleman, I don't exist in your world. A quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers were watching now, some whispering to each other. Richard straightened, his expression cooling. He turned to Amanda, the head flight attendant. This time, his voice wasn't mocking. It was an order. Are you really letting this continue? Amanda was visibly tense, but she couldn't force Camille to leave. Mr. Coleman, we're trying to resolve this situation in the best way possible. Richard cut her off, his voice low, edged with power. Resolve? You think a first-class passenger like me should be forced to argue for a seat? This is ridiculous. He turned back to Camille, and this time, he dropped all pretense. His expression was pure disdain. I need this seat. Can you please cooperate? Camille lifted her chin, her tone still smooth but sharp as glass. I don't think please is the right word when you're trying to take something that isn't yours. Richard's jaw clenched. He hated this. He hated being refused. He hated a woman standing her ground. He hated not having absolute control. Camille wasn't naive. She knew he could destroy her career with a single phone call. But what he didn't know was that she had power too. Richard leaned in closer, his voice dropping into something low, threatening. You do realize that I could make one phone call and ensure you never book another first-class ticket again? The cabin fell into absolute silence. Camille exhaled softly. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned in, just slightly so that Richard would hear every single word. And you know what, Mr. Coleman? She let the silence stretch. Let the weight of the moment settle. I could make one phone call and let the whole world know that a billionaire tried to bully a black woman out of her first-class seat. Let's see who loses more. Richard went still. He hadn't expected that. Amanda's face went pale. Some passengers leaned forward, as if they had just witnessed a knockout punch in a high-stakes power match. Camille remained seated, her eyes never leaving Richard's. And this time, he was the first to look away. He had lost, and Camille hadn't moved an inch. Richard Coleman didn't move. His face remained composed, but his eyes flashed with something unmistakable, irritation. He wasn't used to being denied. He had never been forced to look a woman in the eyes while standing at a disadvantage. No, he couldn't let it end like this. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, reclaiming control. And when he spoke, his voice was slow, measured, calculated. All right. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and unlocked the screen with an effortless swipe. If you want to turn this into a big problem, I'd be happy to oblige. Camille remained still, arms crossed, her gaze never wavering. What exactly do you mean? Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts, then looked up directly at her. I could call the CEO of this airline right now. He paused, deliberate, every syllable laced with intent. And you'd see exactly what happens when a man like me decides someone doesn't belong in first class. His voice wasn't loud, but every word landed heavy as stone. Amanda, the head flight attendant, flinched. David Larkin, the flight supervisor, had just arrived, catching only the last part of Richard's sentence. He glanced between Camille and Richard, and his face tightened with tension. Mr. Coleman, please, David said, his tone controlled but edged with unease. Let's not escalate this any further. Richard let out a cold, dry laugh. Escalate? He repeated, almost mockingly. This is simple. I want this seat, and she refuses to cooperate. A little flexibility, that's all I'm asking. Isn't that fair? Camille's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. You call it flexibility? She tilted her head slightly, voice smooth as silk, but sharp enough to cut. I call it theft. Richard raised an eyebrow, feigning amusement. I call it power. The air in first class thickened. David Larkin exhaled slowly, adjusting his tie. He had handled countless conflicts on flights over the years. But this was different. He knew exactly who Richard Coleman was. He had influence. He had money. And most dangerously, he had the power to make people's lives miserable with a single phone call. David's gaze flickered between Camille and Richard. Then, as if reaching a difficult conclusion, he sighed. Miss Johnson. His voice was steady, but there was something pleading beneath it. I completely understand that you booked this seat legally. But if you were to relinquish it, we would be happy to compensate you, either with a free flight or an exclusive upgrade for another trip. We're simply asking for your cooperation to avoid unnecessary trouble. Amanda, still standing nearby, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Camille felt the pressure closing in from both sides. They weren't ordering her. They weren't threatening her, but they were positioning her as the only one who could keep the peace. She inhaled deeply, keeping her voice calm. Controlled. I understand what you're asking. She looked directly at David, not with anger, but with unshakable clarity. But tell me, why should I be the one inconvenienced just to satisfy a man who thinks he can take whatever he wants? David hesitated. Camille held his gaze, then continued. If I move today, someone else will be forced to move tomorrow. Mr. Coleman isn't the only person who paid for first class. He doesn't get to be prioritized just because he wants to be. Richard let out a short, clipped laugh. Do you really think you can fight me? Camille didn't answer. She simply smiled, a smile free of fear. David saw it. Amanda saw it. Camille wasn't backing down. A bead of sweat formed at David's temple. He knew, if this went any further, it could turn into something far bigger than just a seat dispute. Then a throat cleared. A voice, steady, firm, cut through the tension. From a few rows back, a woman rose to her feet. Sophie Miller, a young attorney, her blonde hair pulled into a sleek ponytail. Every eye in first class turned to her. She folded her arms, her expression icy cold. She has the right to be here. Her voice rang out, unwavering. This isn't just about a seat. It's about basic rights. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. Richard turned, his sharp gaze locking onto Sophie. But she didn't flinch. She looked at David, then Amanda, then, finally, Camille, who remained seated unshaken. A beat of silence. Then a passenger nodded. Then another. A murmur spread across the cabin. Some whispered to their seatmates. Some stole glances at Richard. And for the first time, their expressions weren't filled with automatic deference. The tide was turning. And this time, Camille wasn't standing alone. Something was shifting in first class. At first, when Camille refused to give up her seat, the passengers around her had simply watched, curious, detached, as if observing a minor in-flight inconvenience that had nothing to do with them. But when Sophie Miller spoke up, something changed. A middle-aged man in a sharp gray suit gave a slow, deliberate nod. An older woman, perhaps too familiar with the injustices of the world, tightened her grip on the strap of her purse, her eyes flickering with silent agreement. A young businessman, who had clearly been listening from the start, leaned forward, as if suddenly more invested in the outcome. Camille felt it. She was no longer standing alone, and Richard felt it too. He didn't like it. His lips pressed into a firm line, his gaze darting quickly around the cabin. The same passengers who had once sat in silent deference were now watching him differently, with something bordering on skepticism, as if they were reevaluating the kind of man he was. He despised this feeling. He had walked into countless rooms where people stood the moment he arrived, where his decisions affected thousands with a single word. And yet, here he was, on a commercial flight, being openly challenged by a black woman who had dared to say no. And worse, people were siding with her. Richard turned back to Camille, this time his gaze sharp as steel, the weight of it heavy and searing. "So, you like making a scene?" The patience in his voice was gone. The amusement was gone. What remained was a warning. But Camille only let out a quiet, measured laugh. "I'm not making a scene. You're the one who walked up to my seat and tried to force me out of it." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You really think this is going to end in your favor?" Camille tilted her head, her smile cutting. "I think this is going to end the way it should." Sophie nodded, then turned toward David Larkin, the flight supervisor who still stood there caught in the crossfire. "She's right," Sophie said, her voice clear, unwavering. "She paid for this seat. No one has the right to remove her just because someone else is more important." David pressed his lips together, as if he had just been pushed to the edge of an impossible decision. He knew exactly what this meant. Richard Coleman was not just any passenger. He had power. He had influence. And if he wasn't satisfied, he could make life very difficult for the airline. But if David forcibly removed Camille, this could become a full-scale PR disaster. David looked at Amanda, then at Camille. Then he sighed and made his decision. "Miss Johnson has the right to keep her seat." Silence. Richard froze for half a second, as if the words didn't register. David cleared his throat, this time speaking more firmly. "Mr. Coleman, we apologize for the inconvenience. We can arrange for you to have a different seat in business class. If there's anything you need, the crew will be happy to assist you." This time, Richard didn't move. He had lost. In front of an entire first-class cabin, Richard Coleman, the man who was never denied, who was used to walking into any room and having things arranged to his liking, had just been publicly rejected. And the worst part? No one was on his side. The moment stretched, seconds feeling like an eternity as Richard stood there, processing it. Then, with a slow, stiff nod, he turned. He didn't say another word. He just walked away, moving past the watching passengers, some looking surprised, some satisfied, some simply observing in silence. Camille remained seated, her eyes following Richard's retreating figure. And when he disappeared beyond the curtain, dividing first class from business, Sophie finally exhaled, releasing the tension in her shoulders. It was over, and Camille had won. The plane trembled slightly as the pilot announced the final preparations for takeoff. The lights in first class dimmed, casting a soft glow over the delicate ripples of wine in crystal glasses. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, and yet the air still carried a lingering weight, a silent echo of what had just transpired. Camille leaned back into her seat, her gaze drifting toward the window, but her mind was still caught in the moments before. She had stood her ground. She had refused to yield to Richard Coleman, a man who had built his life on the certainty that he could take whatever he wanted. But even with him gone, she could still feel it, the eyes on her. Some approving, some merely curious, and some displeased. A voice murmured behind her. Did she really have to make such a big deal out of it? A middle-aged man, his tone more irritated than judgmental. A woman, likely his wife, nodded in quiet agreement. Though her voice was soft, it was loud enough for Camille to hear. It was just a seat. If it were me, I would have taken the offer and avoided the trouble. Camille didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly what they looked like. A well-mannered, middle-class couple accustomed to order, to rules, to the belief that the world worked a certain way. And anyone who disrupted that order was the problem. She didn't blame them. They didn't understand. They had never had to fight day after day, year after year, just to be seen, to claim spaces where people silently believed they didn't belong. To them, this was just a seat. But to Camille, it was a symbol. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling slowly. No, she felt no regret, not a single ounce of it. A flight attendant appeared at her side, carefully placing a delicate glass of red wine on the tray in front of her. "Miss Johnson, this is our way of thanking you for your patience." Camille looked up, meeting the woman's gaze. It wasn't an apology, but in her eyes, Camille saw something else, a quiet, unspoken respect. She gave a small nod, lifting the glass, feeling the chilled crystal press against her fingertips. She took a slow sip, letting the wine coat her tongue, its sharp bitterness melting into a subtle, lingering sweetness. She had fought harder battles than this. She had sat in boardrooms where her ideas were ignored because they couldn't believe a black woman could be a CEO. She had walked into elite gatherings where she was judged by the way she looked rather than the success she had built. She had spent her entire life fighting for her seat, not just on this plane, but in this world. And today, once again, she had claimed it. But just as she set her glass down, a voice, low, familiar, too close. Enjoy the moment, Miss Johnson, but don't think for a second that you've won. Camille turned, and there he was, Richard Coleman, standing beside her seat, his expression calm, but his gaze carrying something undeniable. A warning. This wasn't over. As Richard Coleman disappeared behind the curtain, dividing first class from business, a strange, weighted silence settled over the cabin. Camille didn't say a word. She simply took another sip of her wine, letting the dry bitterness spread across her tongue. She didn't look around, but she knew they were watching her. She could feel it, the quiet currents of unspoken thoughts weaving through the air. Some passengers still didn't approve, thinking she had made too much of a scene. Some were reconsidering, realizing that what had just happened wasn't just a personal dispute. It was a statement, a stand. And then there were those who refused to stay silent any longer. A soft clearing of a throat broke the quiet. From a few rows back, Sophie Miller, the young attorney with her sleek blonde ponytail, stood up, arms crossed. Her sharp gaze swept across the cabin before finally settling on Camille. She had every right to stay in her seat. Sophie's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. This isn't just about a seat. This is about principle. Her words rippled through the stillness, like a stone dropped into calm water. A middle-aged man in a gray suit, who had remained silent until now, gave a small but decisive nod. An older woman, perhaps too familiar with life's injustices, adjusted her glasses and let out a quiet, knowing sigh. And then, another voice. A white man in his 30s, likely a businessman, leaned forward, resting an elbow on his armrest. I agree. She paid for her seat. No one had the right to force her out of it. One voice, then another, like fragments of a rising tide. And then a new sound, a single clap, soft, short, then another, and then more. The applause wasn't deafening, but it was undeniable. A quiet but resolute acknowledgement scattered throughout the cabin. Amanda, the head flight attendant, hesitated mid-step as she moved through first class. Her gaze flickered around the cabin, then landed on Camille, her expression unreadable. David Larkin, the flight supervisor, stood near Sophie. He exhaled slowly, as if finally seeing the full picture for the first time. And then he nodded. With deliberate steps, he approached Camille's seat. She held his gaze. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because this time, she wasn't alone. David glanced down at the passenger manifest on his iPad, then turned to Amanda. His voice was low, but Camille heard every word. File a report to the airline. No policy was violated here. She keeps her seat. Amanda pressed her lips together, but she didn't argue, because there was nothing left to argue. The balance had shifted. As the plane rolled toward the runway, Camille let her head rest against the seat, inhaling deeply. Sophie settled back in her own seat, then turned slightly toward Camille. I don't know you, but I like the way you fight. Camille gave a small, knowing smile, her voice steady. I don't fight because I like it. I fight because I have no other choice. Sophie nodded, as if she understood, because she did. Camille had spent her life being doubted, scrutinized, challenged. And every single time, she had stood her ground. And today, on this flight, she had done it again. As the plane lifted into the sky, Camille turned toward the window, watching as the lights of New York City faded beneath her. She knew this story wouldn't end here. She knew that what had happened today would not stay confined to this flight. But most importantly, she knew one undeniable truth. Justice is not something you negotiate. The soft glow of the first-class cabin lights reflected off the polished wood of the small tables beside each seat. In the distance, the low, steady hum of the Boeing 777's engines reverberated through the air, a hypnotic lullaby. Everything should have been over. Camille remained in her seat, sipping her wine, but her mind was anything but at ease. Something was wrong. She could feel it, a strange, lingering sensation, as if the story wasn't finished, as if something unresolved still hovered in the air, unseen but heavy. The other passengers had begun returning to their routines, some sleeping, some scrolling through their phones, others immersed in the in-flight entertainment. But for Camille, the atmosphere had shifted. Something was still hanging there, something waiting. And then a voice. "Doesn't this feel strange to you?" Camille turned. Sophie Miller was reclining in her seat, but her eyes were wide awake. Not the casual gaze of a passing acquaintance, but the sharp, calculating look of someone who had just pieced something together. Camille frowned. "What?" Sophie glanced around, as if ensuring no one else was listening, then lowered her voice. "This whole thing, doesn't it seem off to you?" Camille's fingers tightened slightly around her wine glass, the coolness of the crystal pressing into her palm. Off. Yes. She had felt it from the moment Richard Coleman entered first class, staring down at her, as if he had already known exactly what would happen. As if he had anticipated this confrontation. "What are you saying?" Camille asked, keeping her voice steady, though her thoughts were already racing in a different direction. Sophie leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing. Why would a billionaire like Richard Coleman fight over a first-class seat on a commercial flight? He could have bought the entire row. Hell, he could have chartered a private jet. But instead, he made a scene over a single seat. Camille stilled. She had thought about this before, briefly. But at the time, she had dismissed it as nothing more than the arrogance of a man who always got his way. But if Sophie was right, then this wasn't about the seat. It was never about the seat. It was about her. Camille slowly set her wine glass down, inhaling deeply. She didn't respond right away. Sophie took her silence as permission to continue, her voice slow but certain. "I think he wanted to see how you would react." Camille's head lifted, her gaze locking onto Sophie's. Sophie gave a knowing nod, as if placing a final piece on the chessboard. It wasn't just about whether you'd give up the seat. He wanted to see what you'd do when faced with injustice. He wanted to know what kind of person you are. A chill ran down Camille's spine, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that she had just connected a missing piece, one she hadn't even known was missing. But if this was a test, then the real question was why? Why would Richard Coleman care about her? Why would a real estate tycoon go to such lengths to provoke her? There had to be a reason, and whatever it was, it wasn't simple. A few rows ahead, Richard Coleman sat perfectly still. He was no longer lounging in his seat. Now he sat upright, his eyes fixed blankly ahead. One finger tapped lightly against the armrest. Slow, rhythmic, counting the passing seconds. He wasn't angry. He hadn't cared about losing the seat at all. He was thinking, and if someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed it. The faintest curl of his lips. Not a smirk, not amusement, but something else entirely. A smile without warmth. A smile that carried a single, undeniable truth. He had seen what he needed to see. He had gotten his answer. And that meant he would be back. Camille sank back into her seat, eyes locked on the glass of wine before her. Sophie's words still echoed in her mind. "You wanted to see what kind of person you are?" The sentence cut through her thoughts like an invisible blade. She had faced all kinds of people in her life. The doubters, the ones who underestimated her, the rivals who tried to push her out of the game. But Richard Coleman, he wasn't like any of them. She felt as though he was playing a game where she didn't know all the rules. And she hated that feeling. Beside her, Sophie looked just as deep in thought. She was doing what lawyers did best, analyzing every angle, every possibility. "I think we're missing something," Sophie said, her voice low. Camille turned to her, sharp-eyed. "What do you mean?" Sophie bit her lip, then suddenly leaned forward and pressed the call button for the flight attendant. A minute later, a young woman with a practiced, professional smile approached their seats. "How can I assist you, ma'am?" Sophie returned the smile, but her gaze was razor-sharp. "Just a quick question. who initially requested that Camille vacate her seat. Was it Mr. Coleman, or was someone else involved? Camille held her breath. The flight attendant hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable to most. But to Camille and Sophie, who had spent their lives reading people, that hesitation said everything. Well, Mr. Coleman was the one who spoke up first, but Camille tilted her head slightly, her voice turning cool. But what? The flight attendant cast a quick glance toward business class, where Richard Coleman still sat, then swallowed. But another passenger also inquired about this seat. Before Mr. Coleman even boarded the plane, a chill ran down Camille's spine. Who? Sophie asked immediately. The flight attendant hesitated again, as if debating how much she should reveal. I can't disclose another passenger's identity, but her voice dropped lower. Whoever it was, they weren't seated in first class or business class. Camille and Sophie exchanged a glance. Someone in economy had been interested in her seat before Richard ever entered the equation. It could have been a coincidence, but Camille didn't believe in coincidences. Her throat felt dry, but when she spoke, her voice remained steady. Thank you. That will be all. The flight attendant nodded and turned away, but Camille noticed the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the unmistakable tension of someone who knew more than they were saying. She was hiding something. Sophie crossed her arms, her expression calculating. Someone was targeting you, Camille. Camille didn't answer. She was too busy reconstructing the puzzle in her mind. Someone in economy had shown interest in her seat. Then Richard Coleman had stepped in, deliberately pushing her, testing her. She had assumed this was just a power struggle between her and Richard. But now, she wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe Richard wasn't the one pulling the strings. Maybe he was just another piece on the board. And if that was true, so was she. A few rows ahead, Richard Coleman remained perfectly still. This time, he wasn't tapping his fingers against the seat. This time, he knew. He could sense Camille putting the pieces together. And he knew it was time for him to speak. The moment the flight attendant disappeared, Camille noticed movement ahead. She looked up and locked eyes with Richard Coleman. He was no longer reclining in his seat, no longer carrying the smug ease of a man who had won or the simmering anger of one who had lost. This time, he was different, controlled, calculated. There was no arrogance in his stride, no lingering defiance, just a quiet, careful precision. Sophie noticed it too. She shifted in her seat, fingers tightening slightly against the armrest, as if bracing for another confrontation. But Camille knew this wasn't just a dispute anymore. Richard stopped in front of her seat, his gaze flickering between her and Sophie before he spoke. May I have a word with you, Camille? For the first time, he used her first name. Gone was the condescending tone, the unspoken power play. Camille tilted her head slightly, unmoved. If this is another attempt to make me give up my seat, you're wasting your time. Richard's mouth curved slightly, but there was no humor in it. No, that's over. But there's something I think you should know. Camille glanced at Sophie. Sophie said nothing, only gave a slight nod, a silent signal that she was watching Richard just as closely. Camille gestured toward the empty seat across from her. Talk. Richard pulled out the chair and sat down. A flight attendant passed by, hesitating slightly at the sight of him back in first class, but Richard simply gestured for her to move along. Camille's expression remained unyielding. Well, what do you want to say? Richard didn't answer right away. He rested both elbows on the table, fingers interlaced, as if carefully choosing his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, measured. Do you really think I needed that seat? Camille's eyes narrowed. No. Richard nodded slightly, his gaze flickering over her face, confirming that she understood. Then have you ever asked yourself why I did it? A chill ran down Camille's spine. She had thought about it, but hearing Richard say it aloud, it unsettled her. Sophie leaned forward, eyes locked on him. You were testing her? Richard turned to Sophie, his lips curling into something almost amused. Smarter than I expected, Attorney Miller. Sophie didn't look the least bit entertained. Why? Camille's voice was steady, but sharper this time. Richard studied her for a moment, then leaned in slightly. When he spoke, his voice was low. Private. Just for them. Because I'm not the only one on this flight who wants to know who you are. The entire first-class cabin fell into an eerie silence. Camille held Richard's gaze, but she felt it, her heartbeat slowing for just a fraction of a second. Sophie exhaled quietly, arms still crossed over her chest. But Camille could tell she felt it too. Something larger was at play. What do you mean? Camille asked, her voice unwavering, but laced with quiet caution. Richard's eyes darkened. I'm not your enemy, Camille. At least, not right now. Camille let out a cold, humorless laugh. And I'm supposed to believe that? Richard didn't flinch at her doubt. He simply shook his head, as if he had expected this reaction. I expect you to believe the truth. And the truth is, there are people far more powerful than me who are paying attention to you. A shiver ran through Camille's body. She had already suspected there was someone else involved. But hearing it from Richard Coleman, a man who could change entire industries with a single decision, confirmed it. Her spine straightened, her expression darkening. Why? Richard shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I don't know for sure, but I do know one thing. Whoever they are, they wanted to see how you'd react under pressure. They wanted to know if you would fight back or fold. Camille's fingers curled tightly around the base of her wine glass. Now it was clear. The first-class seat had never been the target. She had been the target. Richard observed her reaction for a long moment, then finally pushed back his chair. Listen, he said, his voice devoid of its earlier arrogance. I wasn't behind this. I was just the one chosen to create the situation and observe your response. But here's the thing. I don't play anyone's pawn without knowing who's moving the pieces. He paused, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. And I don't like being used. Camille studied him, searching for any sign of deception. But this time, she found none. For the first time since meeting him, she had the distinct feeling that Richard Coleman was telling the truth. He straightened his jacket, then gave her one last look. Be careful, Camille Johnson. His voice dropped lower, more deliberate. You have no idea whose game you just stepped into. He didn't wait for a response. This time, he truly left. Sophie inhaled deeply, her gaze still locked onto Camille. Do you think he was telling the truth? Camille nodded slowly. I think this time he was. But if Richard was telling the truth, then the real question was, who was watching Camille, and why? The Boeing 777 continued its course through the night, its dim navigation lights reflecting off the clouds below. The first-class cabin had fallen into silence, but inside Camille's mind, everything was spinning in a relentless storm. She could feel the cold glass of wine pressing against her fingers, yet she had lost all interest in taking another sip. Richard Coleman's words still echoed in her mind, a soundtrack she couldn't turn off. There are people far more powerful than me who are interested in you. She was used to being underestimated, challenged, discarded. But this time, she wasn't just up against an arrogant man trying to take her seat. She was facing an unseen force, a game where she didn't even know the rules. And that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Beside her, Sophie sat in contemplative silence. The young attorney hadn't spoken since Richard left, but Camille could see it in her eyes. She was calculating something. At last, Sophie spoke, her voice low but firm. Do you want to know what I think? Camille raised an eyebrow, but didn't turn. Go on. Sophie took a deep breath, as if assembling the pieces of a puzzle in her mind. If someone is really behind this, then this isn't just a test. It's an evaluation. Camille tilted her head slightly, this time giving Sophie her full attention. An evaluation? Sophie nodded, her eyes sharpening with insight. Have you ever considered that maybe they're looking for someone like you? The words struck Camille like a sudden gust of wind, stealing the breath from her lungs. Looking for someone like her? She had spent her life being dismissed, overlooked. It had never occurred to her that she might be sought after. And if that was true, what did they want from her? The first-class cabin suddenly felt suffocating, though the temperature hadn't changed. An invisible weight pressed against Camille's chest, making every breath feel heavier. She had faced difficult choices before, but never one as shadowed in uncertainty as this. And then, beep, the overhead intercom chimed, snapping Camille out of her thoughts. A familiar voice came through, steady yet edged with something cold. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain James Miller. We have received an emergency landing request from the airline. The crew will provide further details shortly. Please remain seated. Emergency landing? Camille and Sophie exchanged a glance immediately. This was no coincidence. Every instinct in Camille's body screamed that something was happening, something far from ordinary. The first-class cabin remained eerily quiet, but she could see passengers stirring, murmuring amongst themselves, trying to piece together what was going on. Sophie tightened her grip on the armrest, suspicion flickering in her gaze. Something isn't right. Camille said nothing, but she didn't need to. She had flown more times than she could count, and emergency landings were rare, especially without a clear reason. One question now loomed above all else. Was this about her? From the business class section, Richard Coleman suddenly rose to his feet. The composure he had worn so effortlessly was gone. This time, when his eyes found Camille's, there was no smug amusement, only a silent warning. The landing announcement chimed through the cabin, but Camille no longer paid attention to those familiar words. She sat upright, eyes fixed ahead, yet her mind was spinning with everything that had just unfolded. The confrontation with Richard Coleman was over, or at least she thought it was. But the moment the plane touched down, a flight attendant approached, leaning in close to her seat, voice formal, yet chillingly impersonal. "Miss Camille Johnson, please come with me immediately." Not Richard, not any other passenger involved in the dispute. Just her. A slow, simmering sense of injustice tightened in Camille's chest. No one needed to say it outright. She knew exactly what was happening. She had learned from a young age how to recognize discrimination, the kind no one ever admitted to. The averted gazes, the convoluted explanations, the so-called standard procedures that always seemed to apply only to her and to those who looked like her. And now here was again. Sophie Miller didn't need to be told twice. The moment she heard the attendant's words, she rose from her seat, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "I'm sorry, but we need to know why before she leaves this plane." The attendant hesitated, momentarily thrown off, but still maintaining her professional veneer. "We just need to verify some information with Miss Johnson. This is standard procedure when a dispute occurs on board." Camille's lips curved, but the smile held no warmth. "Standard?" Her voice was quiet, but firm. Mr. Coleman was part of that dispute too. "So why am I the only one being asked to leave?" A heavy silence rippled through first class. Some passengers turned away, feigning indifference. Others glanced at Camille with unreadable expressions, as if they too had just recognized the glaring inequity. But the flight attendant had no immediate answer. She hesitated, then straightened, clinging to her scripted professionalism. "We're simply following airline protocol, ma'am." Camille inhaled deeply, keeping her voice steady. "Fine. I'll go, but my attorney is coming with me." The flight attendant stiffened, her eyes flickering. She hadn't expected that. Sophie smiled, slow and knowing. The kind of smile that precedes the unmasking of an unjust system. "That would be me." The flight attendant had no choice but to nod. Camille stepped out of first class with her head held high, unrushed, unapologetic. She was no troublemaker, but she would not allow herself to be treated as if she were guilty. She had done nothing wrong, and she would prove it. Camille stepped into the airport conference room, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the cold, polished floor. She was unshaken. Across from her sat two men, one in a tailored suit with an airline name badge pinned to his chest, clearly a senior representative, and another in an airport security uniform. The air was chilled, impersonal. They had done this before. Camille could see it in their expressions, their quiet expectation that she would nod, accept their explanation, and leave without a fight. But Camille was not that kind of person. Beside her, Sophie Miller was already poised, her gaze razor-sharp, prepared to slice through every lie they were about to offer. The airline rep adjusted his tie, clearing his throat before speaking. "Miss Johnson, thank you for your cooperation. We just need to clarify a few details regarding the incident on your flight." Camille tilted her head slightly, her gaze never leaving him. "Incident?" Her voice was low but weighted. Would you care to specify exactly what incident led to me being summoned here? The man hesitated just for a moment, but quickly recovered. The dispute between you and Mr. Coleman drew the attention of both the crew and other passengers. To ensure the best experience for all travelers, we need to confirm that there was no misunderstanding. Camille's lips curled into a faint, cold smile. Then tell me, why am I the only one asked to leave the plane? Why isn't Richard Coleman sitting in this room right now? Silence. The airline rep shifted in his seat, clearly searching for a way to sidestep the question. But Sophie didn't let him. Let's not pretend here, she said, leaning back, her voice sharp with thinly veiled mockery. Is this because Mr. Coleman is a VIP with your airline? The man pressed his lips together. Camille saw it. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, the reluctance to admit a truth he knew was wrong but didn't dare speak aloud. The airport supervisor, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat, attempting to diffuse the tension. Miss Johnson, we assure you this has nothing to do with discrimination. However, you must understand that certain passengers like what? Camille cut him off, her voice unwavering, her eyes burning with conviction. The man's mouth pressed into a thin line, but Camille already knew the answer. Like Richard Coleman? Her voice remained calm, but carried the force of a hammer. Like powerful white men you're afraid to offend? The room fell into absolute stillness. The airline rep exhaled heavily. We sincerely apologize if you feel you were treated unfairly. Camille let out a quiet, humorless laugh. No, I don't feel like I was treated unfairly. I know I was. Beside her, Sophie arched an eyebrow, clearly enjoying how Camille was steering the conversation into a corner they couldn't escape. Camille leaned forward, her voice dropping, but gaining even more power. Listen carefully, because I'll say this once. I paid for a first-class ticket just like anyone else. I had the right to sit in my seat. And when a powerful man tried to take that right away from me, I stood my ground. Not because I wanted to cause a scene, but because I had no reason to step aside. She let the words sink in. But instead of supporting the customer who was in the right, your airline chose to protect a man like Richard Coleman. And when you couldn't force me to comply, you attempted to humiliate me by dragging me in here, like I was the one who had done something wrong. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes cold and cutting. That's not a misunderstanding. That's discrimination. The airline rep was completely silent, because he knew Camille was right. Sophie let the pause stretch before finally speaking. So, here's where we stand. Her voice was smooth, professional, but edged with a quiet warning. You have two choices. One, you continue making excuses, attempting to justify something we all know is indefensible. But let me remind you, we have enough evidence to take this story public. And I can guarantee that Miss Johnson's voice will be heard. The airport supervisor shifted uncomfortably, calculating the damage. And the second choice? He asked. Camille stood up slowly, adjusting her blazer with effortless confidence. A public apology. Her voice was calm, controlled, but undeniable. A clear commitment that this airline will change its policies to ensure that situations like this do not happen again. She leveled her gaze at the airline rep. Show me that your company actually respects all passengers, regardless of race, gender, or status. The man swallowed, his throat dry. He had no way out. 15 minutes later, a formal statement was drafted. The airline admitted fault, acknowledged their mishandling of the situation, and pledged to review their internal procedures to ensure fairness for all passengers. Camille didn't walk away with just an apology. She walked away leaving a mark, a reminder that injustice only prevails when no one stands up to it. Camille stepped out of the conference room and took a deep breath. The world outside remained the same. Loud, relentless, strangers brushing past one another without a second glance. But to Camille, something had shifted. Sophie walked beside her, the hint of a triumphant smirk still on her lips. You know, Sophie said, her tone carrying a trace of amusement. Not everyone can force an airline corporation to back down. You did what most people wouldn't have had the patience to see through. Camille let out a quiet exhale, her lips curving slightly, but not in satisfaction. "I didn't do this to win," she murmured. "I did it because I know too many people have been in my position before and never had the chance to be heard." Sophie nodded, something knowing in her gaze. "And now, they have you to speak for them." An hour after Camille left the airport, the airline's public apology began making waves on social media. "We sincerely apologize to passenger Camille Johnson for the inconvenience experienced on our flight. Our airline is committed to reviewing our customer service policies to ensure fairness and equal treatment for all passengers." But the story didn't end there. A passenger on the flight, perhaps one of the silent witnesses to everything that had transpired, had recorded the argument between Camille and Richard Coleman, capturing every word, every moment of the airline's response. The video made its way to Twitter, and within hours, it had gone viral. Hashtag Justice for Camille became a trending topic. Thousands of people commented, sharing their own stories. Times they had been treated unfairly because of their race, their gender, their status. One comment from a Black woman garnered thousands of likes. "I was once asked to give up my seat on an international flight, despite having paid in full. They told me someone more important needed it. I stayed quiet because I didn't want trouble." But Camille Johnson didn't stay quiet. She spoke up for all of us. Camille read those words, and for the first time, she felt a different weight settle over her. Not frustration, but responsibility. She had never set out to be the face of a movement. She had simply wanted to hold her ground, not just on that flight, but in life. But now she understood. She was no longer fighting just for herself. 3 days later, Richard Coleman appeared on the news. The arrogance he had worn so easily on that flight was gone, replaced by the weary resignation of a man forced into submission by the weight of public scrutiny. "I sincerely apologize for my behavior on that flight," he said. "I realize now that I acted inappropriately, and I respect the rights of all passengers." Camille felt no satisfaction in watching him bow to public pressure. She hadn't done this to make him lose. She had done this to prove that justice could still win, if someone was willing to stand up and demand it. Standing by the glass window of her company's high-rise office, Camille gazed out at the restless streets of San Francisco. She took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth seeping into her fingers. That flight was supposed to be just another routine trip. Instead, it had become a declaration. Sophie walked in, setting a folder on the desk. "A few civil rights organizations have reached out. They want you to speak at a panel on fairness in the airline industry." Camille let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I'm not an activist, Sophie. I just want to do my job." Sophie raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "You don't have to be an activist to create change, Camille. You just have to keep doing what you've already done, refusing to let anyone decide your place for you." Camille looked out at the endless blue sky beyond the glass. She knew there would be more battles ahead. In boardrooms, in negotiations, in places where people still weren't ready to accept someone like her at the table. But she also knew she wasn't alone. And more than that, she had proven something that could never be undone. Her place, on that flight, or anywhere else, was hers to claim. Camille Johnson's story is more than just an incident on a flight. It is a symbol of the ongoing fight against injustice in modern society. Discrimination still lingers in many aspects of life, from workplaces and education to public services. So what is the lesson to be learned? Speak up when you witness injustice. Use the power of community to demand change. Do not bow to unreasonable pressure. Everyone has the right to be treated with fairness. And when one person takes a stand, they are not just defending themselves, they are paving the way for others to do the same. What would you do if you were in Camille's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories.